here! Move to the back of the plane right now!
Pilot told black pregnant woman to move to the back, and moments later her husband is his new boss in a way that proves sometimes the passengers pilots humiliate are married to men who control whether those pilots ever fly again, are women whose husbands oversee every route and every crew member and every career decision, are pregnant black women who've been told to move to the back like it's 1955 instead of 2025, like segregation never ended but just learned to hide behind claims about seating. Errors and passenger comfort, like the phrase move to the back doesn't carry the weight of history and hatred and the particular violence of telling a black person they don't belong in the front of anything. We don't need your kind up here. This is first class. This is for passengers who actually belong, who actually paid for these seats, who didn't get some kind of error ticket or charity upgrade, so you need to move to the back of the plane right now before I have security remove you from my aircraft. Do you understand me? Back of the plane where you belong. Captain Richard Bradley said to Monique Davis, who was sitting in seat 2A of Delta Airlines Flight 2156 from New York to Los Angeles, who was 7 months pregnant with her belly pressing against the seatbelt, who'd boarded early because her doctor had written a letter recommending first-class travel for maximum comfort during her third trimester, who'd settled into her window seat with relief and closed her eyes hoping for rest, who'd done absolutely nothing except exist while black and pregnant in a space where this pilot had decided she didn't belong, and his words hit her like physical blows, like accusations wrapped in authority, like racism delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for treating passengers like they were less than human. The accusation your kind landed in the cabin of Delta Flight 2156 with the weight of every segregation sign that had ever been posted, every drinking fountain marked colored only, every restaurant that had refused service, every space that had told black people they were unwelcome, they were wrong, they were fundamentally unsuited to occupy areas reserved for white people who naturally deserved better. And Monique felt the words settle into her chest, felt her baby kick as if responding to her elevated heart rate, felt her hands start to shake not with fear but with the effort of staying composed, of not crying, of not breaking down in front of the first-class passengers who were watching this confrontation with expressions ranging from uncomfortable to satisfied, who were witnessing her humiliation but not one of them was speaking up, not one person was saying this is wrong, leave this pregnant woman alone. This wasn't ancient history, wasn't something Monique's grandmother had experienced that she only knew from stories and photographs. This was happening right now in 2025 on a major commercial airline where diversity training and anti-discrimination policies were supposedly in place, where a pilot in uniform representing a company that claimed to value all passengers had just told a pregnant black woman to move to the back, had used the exact language of segregation without apparent awareness or maybe with complete awareness, with deliberate choice to echo Jim Crow because he knew those words would hurt, would communicate exactly how much contempt he had for her presence in his first-class cabin. And if you think racism in aviation is something we solved decades ago, if you believe we've evolved past pilots and crew deciding who belongs where based on skin color rather than tickets, then you need to understand that hatred didn't disappear when laws changed. It just learned to hide behind claims about seating errors and passenger comfort and security concerns, while wielding the same dehumanizing power it always wielded, maybe worse now because it operates while everyone pretends. Equality exists, while companies post diversity statements, while people insist we're post-racial even as black passengers are told to move to the back. Monique had experienced microaggressions throughout her pregnancy, had dealt with strangers touching her belly without permission, store employees following her, doctors dismissing her pain, the constant low-level discrimination that came with being black and visibly pregnant in spaces where people made assumptions about her circumstances, her choices, her worthiness. But having a pilot in uniform tell her to move to the back while she was 7 months pregnant and exhausted and just trying to get to Los Angeles felt different, felt like violence, felt like being transported back to an era she'd only known through her grandmother's stories, through history books, through the collective memory of indignities that black people had endured and overcome, except apparently they hadn't overcome them because here she was in 2025 being told the exact same thing her grandmother had been told in 1955. She'd been shocked when Captain Bradley first stopped at her row, when he'd looked at her with immediate suspicion, when he demanded to see her boarding pass like her presence required explanation, but as his language escalated, as he moved from questioning her ticket to telling her she didn't belong to finally saying move to the back, Monique realized with terrible familiarity that this wasn't new, wasn't surprising despite being shocking, was exactly the kind of racism she'd experienced in different forms her whole life, was predictable even though it shouldn't be, was another data point in the endless evidence that being pregnant and accomplished and having paid for first class provided no protection against people who decided your skin color made you suspicious. "Sir, my ticket is legitimate," Monique said, keeping her voice steady despite the tears threatening. "I booked this seat weeks ago. My doctor recommended first class because I'm 7 months pregnant and I need the extra space and comfort. There's no error. I belong here. I paid for the seat. Now please let me rest." And she pulled out her phone to show him the booking confirmation, the receipt, the doctor's letter, everything that should have ended this confrontation immediately but that she knew wouldn't matter because Captain Bradley had already decided she was wrong, was lying, was trying to occupy space she hadn't earned. If you believe pregnant women deserve dignity regardless of their skin color, keep watching because what happens when this passenger calls her husband will restore your faith that sometimes racism targets exactly the wrong person. And if you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you paid to be, drop a comment below and tell us your story. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because you need to see what happens when move to the back becomes the phrase that ends a pilot's career. This story doesn't end the way Captain Bradley thinks. So hit that like button if you stand against airline discrimination and subscribe to this channel because we're exposing racism that happens at 30,000 feet. Captain Bradley looked at Monique's documentation with barely concealed contempt and said, "I don't care what your phone shows. I don't care what letter you have. I'm telling you there's been an error and you need to move to economy now." And a flight attendant standing nearby, a white man named Marcus, actually laughed and said loud enough for other passengers to hear. Maybe she thought first class meant the first seat she saw, and other passengers laughed too. And Monique felt humiliation wash over her in waves, felt her baby kicking harder as if responding to her distress, felt the weight of every eye in first class judging her, dismissing her, agreeing with Captain Bradley that she didn't belong. But to understand how a pilot ended up telling a pregnant black woman to move to the back, how casual racism operated with such confidence on a commercial aircraft in 2025. How Monique Davis ended up in a confrontation that would cost Captain Bradley everything. We need to go back 6 hours to a morning in Brooklyn where this day started not with discrimination but with hope and careful preparation and a couple saying goodbye before a business trip. Monique Davis, 33 years old, was a licensed architect who'd spent the last 8 years building a career at one of New York's premier design firms, specializing in sustainable urban housing projects that served low-income communities, work she was passionate about because it combined her technical skills with her commitment to social justice, to creating beautiful functional spaces for people who deserved dignity in their living environments regardless of their economic circumstances. She was 7 months pregnant with her first child, a daughter she and her husband David had been planning for years, had delayed until their careers were established and their lives were stable, had prepared for with the kind of thoroughness that came from being black professionals who understood that every advantage they could give their child would matter in a world that would judge her before knowing her, would make assumptions based on appearance before recognizing her worth. Her husband David Davis was Chief Operating Officer of Delta Airlines, second in command only to the CEO, responsible for overseeing all flight operations, all crew assignments, all personnel decisions, every pilot and flight attendant and gate agent, the entire operational infrastructure of a major carrier. And he'd built that career over 15 years starting as a management trainee and working his way through every department, earning promotions through competence and strategic thinking and the particular excellence that black executives had to demonstrate to advance in corporate America. But Monique had never leveraged David's position, had never mentioned his name when booking flights or dealing with airline staff, had built her own career independently and felt strongly that she deserved to be treated with respect based on her own merit rather than her husband's authority, that using his position would somehow diminish her, would confirm stereotypes that successful black women only achieved through connections rather than capability. That morning Monique had packed carefully for her 3-day trip to Los Angeles where she was presenting her firm's proposal for an affordable housing complex to a city planning commission, had chosen comfortable clothes that accommodated her pregnancy while maintaining professionalism, had double-checked that she had all her presentation materials, her doctor's letter recommending first-class travel, her prenatal vitamins, everything she'd need to be successful and comfortable during the trip. David had driven her to JFK Airport, had kissed her goodbye at departures, had said call me when you land, I love you both, touching her belly gently, and Monique had smiled and said we'll be fine, it's just a routine flight, I'll text you from LA, not knowing that routine would become traumatic, that fine would become humiliating, that the flight would end with David using every bit of his authority to destroy the career of a pilot who'd targeted his wife. Check-in at JFK had gone smoothly, the gate agent processing her first-class ticket without comment or question. Security had been normal, slightly slower because pregnancy meant additional screening, but TSA officers had been professional and courteous, and Monique had waited at the gate feeling cautiously optimistic, feeling like maybe this trip would be uneventful, that her doctor's concerns about travel stress were overblown, that flying first class would provide the comfort she needed to arrive in LA rested and ready for her presentation. Boarding was called for first-class passengers and those needing extra time, and Monique had walked down the jetway grateful for early boarding, grateful she wouldn't have to navigate a crowded aisle with her pregnant belly, and she'd found seat 2A, the window seat she preferred, and she'd settled in with relief, had stowed her bag, had reclined slightly, had closed her eyes hoping to rest before takeoff. Other first-class passengers were mostly business travelers, white men and women in suits carrying laptops and briefcases, people who flew frequently and expected certain standards of service, and they'd boarded and settled with the casual efficiency of experienced flyers, and the flight attendants working first class, a young black woman and an older white woman, had been pleasant and professional, offering newspapers and taking drink orders, and Monique had thought everything was fine, had thought she'd made the right choice booking first class despite the expense. Then Captain Richard Bradley had entered the cabin, a white man probably in his mid-50s with a particular bearing of someone who'd been flying for decades, who carried authority like a uniform he'd earned through years of experience, who walked through first class with the confidence of someone who controlled everything about this flight, from when it took off to who sat where, to which passengers deserved courtesy and which deserved suspicion, and he was doing his pre-flight check, greeting passengers with professional warmth, asking business travelers if they needed anything, commenting on the weather in Los Angeles, performing the routine that pilots did to establish rapport and demonstrate they were paying attention to passenger comfort, and Monique had watched him work the cabin with half-closed eyes, not really paying attention because she was exhausted and just wanted rest, not anticipating that his attention would soon focus on her with intensity that felt like violence. Captain Bradley reached row 2 and stopped, and Monique felt his presence before she opened her eyes fully, felt someone staring at her with focus that made her uncomfortable, and when she looked up she saw him standing in the aisle looking directly at her, not with the pleasant greeting he'd given other passengers but with an expression that registered first surprise and then suspicion, and his jaw visibly tightened, his professional warmth evaporating as he processed her presence, a pregnant black woman in seat 2A wearing comfortable clothes rather than business attire, carrying herself with quiet dignity rather than the deferential gratitude he apparently expected from passengers who didn't look like they belonged in first class. "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass," Captain Bradley said, his tone shifting from the warmth he'd used with other passengers to something cooler and more formal, something that communicated immediate distrust, and other passengers in nearby rows noticed the shift, noticed that the captain who'd been so pleasant moments ago had become stern and official, noticed that something about Monique had triggered a response that the white passengers hadn't triggered, and they watched with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment as Monique pulled out her phone to show him her mobile boarding pass. "Of course," Monique said, keeping her voice polite despite the discomfort building in her chest, and she unlocked her phone and pulled up the boarding pass that clearly showed her name, her seat assignment 2A, her frequent flyer number, her confirmation code, everything that should have satisfied his inquiry immediately, and she held it out for him to see, held it with the patience of someone who'd had to prove legitimacy more times than should have been necessary, who understood that being black meant being questioned in situations where white people were trusted, who'd learned to comply with requests that felt like accusations because compliance was safer than resistance even when you'd done nothing wrong. Captain Bradley took Monique's phone and examined the boarding pass with scrutiny that went far beyond what was necessary, held it close to his face and then at arm's length, studied the barcode and the seat assignment and the passenger name. Took so long that Monique felt anxiety spike, felt other passengers' attention intensifying, felt the weight of being singled out for investigation that the businessman across the aisle and the woman behind her and the couple in row 3 had not received. Despite boarding with identical tickets, and she understood with sinking recognition that this wasn't routine verification, this was profiling. This was a pilot who'd looked at her and decided something was wrong based on nothing except his assumptions about who belonged in first class and who didn't, about what successful passengers looked like and what characteristics suggested fraud or error or unworthiness. There's been a seating error, Captain Bradley said finally, handing Monique's phone back to her but not with apology or concern, with certainty, with the tone of someone delivering a verdict rather than identifying a problem. And Monique said, "I'm sorry, what error? I booked this seat 3 weeks ago. Everything was confirmed. I received my boarding pass without any issues. What error are you referring to?" And her voice stayed calm but showed strain now, showed the effort required to remain polite when being accused of something she hadn't done, when being told her legitimate purchase was somehow wrong. "First class is reserved for passengers who booked correctly," Captain Bradley said, and he paused deliberately before continuing, looking Monique up and down with an examination so thorough and so judgmental it felt like assault, taking in her jeans and her maternity top and her natural hair pulled back in a simple style and her lack of jewelry beyond wedding ring and small earrings, taking in everything that apparently signaled to him that she couldn't afford first class, that she must have gotten the ticket through error or deception or some kind of system glitch that needed correcting. And he said, "You'll need to move to the back. We have seats available in economy. This is a mistake that needs to be fixed before we can take off." The phrase "move to the back" hung in the air between them, hung in the confined space of the first-class cabin, hung with the weight of history that Captain Bradley either didn't recognize or didn't care about, hung with echoes of segregation and Rosa Parks and bus boycotts and the entire civil rights struggle that had been fought specifically against that command, against the idea that black people belonged in the back while white people occupied the front, against the dehumanizing geography of racism that assigned worth based on skin color and relegated entire populations to inferior spaces, and Monique felt tears threatening because this couldn't be happening, couldn't be real. A pilot in 2025 couldn't actually be telling her to move to the back like segregation had never ended. "So there's no error," Monique said, her voice shaking slightly now with emotion she was struggling to control. "I booked seat 2A legitimately. I paid for first class. My doctor recommended it because I'm 7 months pregnant and I need the extra space and comfort for the flight. I have documentation. I have my receipt. I have everything that proves this seat is mine. There's no mistake except the one you're making right now by assuming I don't belong here." And she pulled up her email confirmation on her phone, showed him the receipt with her name and the seat assignment and the purchase date, showed him the doctor's letter recommending first-class travel during her 3rd trimester, showed him everything that should have ended this confrontation immediately, should have prompted apology and embarrassment, should have made Captain Bradley recognize he'd profiled a passenger based on appearance and needed to back down gracefully. But instead his face hardened, his authority solidifying rather than softening, his commitment to his initial judgment overriding any evidence that contradicted it. "I don't know how you got this ticket," Captain Bradley said, his voice rising now, loud enough that every passenger in first class could hear clearly, loud enough that passengers still boarding in economy could hear the confrontation, loud enough to ensure maximum humiliation. "But you're making other passengers uncomfortable. This situation needs to be resolved immediately. You need to move to economy now or I'll have security escort you off my aircraft. Do you understand me? This is my plane. And I decide who sits where. Now gather your belongings and move before this becomes a bigger problem than it already is." And his threat was explicit now, was the full weight of pilot authority being leveraged against a pregnant woman whose only crime was existing in a space where he'd decided she didn't belong, whose only offense was challenging his judgment with facts and documentation that he refused to accept. Monique looked around the first-class cabin hoping someone would speak up, hoping one of the passengers who'd been watching this confrontation would say this is wrong, leave this woman alone, she's obviously pregnant and exhausted and her ticket is legitimate, hoping that basic human decency would prompt intervention, but instead she saw faces that ranged from uncomfortable avoidance to active approval, saw people who'd pulled out phones to record but not to help, to document but not to defend, to capture content for social media without using their voices to challenge injustice happening right in front of them. The woman directly across the aisle, white and probably in her 60s wearing expensive jewelry and designer clothes, actually clutched her pearls in that theatrical way that communicated both shock and satisfaction, and she nodded at Captain Bradley with an expression that said, "Yes, you're right, she doesn't belong here, thank you for handling this." And Monique felt betrayal cut through her because this woman who was old enough to remember the civil rights movement, who'd lived through the 1960s, who should have known better, was actively supporting discrimination that echoed segregation. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats but said nothing, avoided eye contact when Monique looked their way, pleading silently for someone to acknowledge this was wrong, turned their attention to phones or magazines or windows, chose the comfort of silence over the discomfort of intervention, chose protecting their own peaceful flights over defending a stranger being humiliated, and their collective silence felt like participation, felt like endorsement, felt like agreement that Monique probably didn't belong in first class, that Captain Bradley's suspicion was reasonable, that investigating her ticket while trusting white passengers' tickets was appropriate rather than discriminatory, and Monique understood with devastating clarity that she was alone in this, that no one was coming to help, that she'd have to navigate this violation by herself while an audience watched and recorded and stayed silent. Marcus, the male flight attendant who'd been working the cabin earlier, approached from the galley, and for a moment Monique hoped he was coming to de-escalate, to tell Captain Bradley that the passenger's documentation was legitimate and this needed to stop, to use his position as crew to intervene on behalf of someone being treated unfairly, but instead Marcus looked at Monique and then at Captain Bradley and smirked. Actually smirked at the situation, and said loud enough for passengers in multiple rows to hear. Maybe she thought first class meant the first seat she saw, not understanding that first class requires actually purchasing a first class ticket, and his mockery was deliberate and cruel, was designed to humiliate, was joining Captain Bradley's discrimination rather than challenging it, and laughter rippled through the cabin, actual laughter from passengers who found Marcus's joke funny, who thought mocking a pregnant black woman being forced from her seat was entertainment rather than tragedy. Monique felt something break inside her hearing that laughter, hearing passengers find humor in her humiliation, in her violation, in the racism that was operating so openly and confidently that a flight attendant felt comfortable making jokes about it, that other passengers felt safe laughing, that no one in this entire first-class cabin thought this was wrong enough to speak up, to say stop, to challenge the pilot and the flight attendant who were tag-teaming discrimination against someone who'd done nothing except book a ticket and try to travel while black and pregnant. She felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall, refused to give Captain Bradley and Marcus and the laughing passengers the satisfaction of seeing her cry, refused to break down even though breaking was exactly what she felt like doing, even though the weight of being targeted and mocked and abandoned by every person around her made breathing difficult. If you're watching this and you've ever stayed silent when someone was being discriminated against because speaking up felt uncomfortable, subscribe to this channel right now and promise yourself you'll be braver next time, because what happens when this pregnant woman calls her husband will show you that silence enables cruelty while intervention can change everything. So hit that subscribe button if you believe pregnant black women deserve dignity, because Monique needed that cabin full of passengers to defend her and got laughter and phone cameras instead. Captain Bradley leaned closer to Monique, invaded her personal space in a way that felt threatening, in a way that made her press back against her window seat trying to create distance, and he said quietly but with enough volume that nearby passengers could hear, "We don't need your kind up here. This is first class. This is for passengers who belong, who actually paid for these seats, who understand that there are standards. Now move to the back of the plane where you belong before I make this even more difficult for you." And his words "your kind" landed with the full weight of racial slurs, landed with the explicit racism that had been implicit in his earlier demands, landed with confirmation that this wasn't about seating errors or passenger comfort but about a pilot who decided that black passengers didn't deserve first class, that Monique's presence violated some unspoken rule about who occupied premium spaces, and Monique felt her hands begin to tremble not with fear but with the enormous effort of staying composed, of not screaming, of not crying, of maintaining the dignity that Captain Bradley was actively trying to strip from her. Her baby kicked hard against her ribs, kicked with unusual intensity as if responding to Monique's elevated heart rate, to the stress hormones flooding her system, to the violation happening to her mother, and Monique placed her hand on her belly feeling her daughter move and thinking about what kind of world she was bringing this child into, what kind of racism her daughter would face, whether being 7 months pregnant provided any protection at all, or whether vulnerability just made you a more acceptable target for people who decided your skin color made you less than human, less deserving of basic dignity, less worthy of the seats you'd paid for and the respect you'd earned. She thought about her grandmother who'd lived through actual segregation, who'd been forced to use colored-only facilities, who'd sat in the back of buses not by choice but by law, who'd fought and marched and risked her life so that Monique's generation wouldn't have to endure that particular indignity. And here was Monique in 2025 being told to move to the back by a pilot who apparently thought segregation had been a good idea worth reviving, who thought telling a black woman she didn't belong in first class was acceptable exercise of his authority rather than explicit racism that should end his career. Marcus was still standing nearby looking pleased with himself, looking like his joke had been well received and his mockery had served its purpose, and he said to Captain Bradley, "Should I call security now? Should I have her escorted off before she causes more disruption? We need to get this flight moving and she's holding everything up by refusing to cooperate," and his characterization of Monique as the problem, as the disruptive passenger causing delays, as the obstacle preventing normal operations, made her feel like she was losing her mind, like reality had inverted, like defending her right to sit in a seat she'd paid for was somehow criminal behavior while the pilot telling her to move to the back was appropriate crew conduct. And she looked at Marcus and said, "I'm not causing disruption. I'm sitting in my assigned seat. I've shown my ticket and my documentation. The only people disrupting this flight are you and Captain Bradley who are refusing to let me travel in peace." Other passengers continued watching this confrontation with fascination mixed with discomfort, continued recording on their phones while staying silent, continued bearing witness without intervening, and Monique felt their complicity as acutely as she felt Captain Bradley's explicit racism, felt abandoned by every person in this cabin who could have spoken up but chose not to, who could have said this is wrong but decided their comfort mattered more than her dignity, who could have used their privilege and their voices to challenge authority but instead used their phones to document injustice they had no intention of preventing, and she understood that bystander silence was its own form of violence, was active choice rather than passive observation, was decision that passengers made when they calculated that defending a pregnant black woman might make their own flights more complicated, so better to stay quiet and watch it happen. A businessman several rows back actually looked satisfied by what was happening, looked like he'd been bothered by Monique's presence in first class and was glad Captain Bradley was handling it, was relieved that someone with authority was enforcing the unspoken rules about who belonged where, and his expression of approval made Monique feel sick, made her recognize that Captain Bradley wasn't acting alone, wasn't expressing views that were unusual or extreme, was voicing racism that multiple passengers in this cabin apparently shared, that lived beneath the surface of polite society and emerged when people thought they were in safe spaces with others who agreed, when they thought their prejudice would be validated rather than challenged. The two flight attendants who'd been kind during initial boarding, the young black woman and the older white woman, were notably absent from this confrontation, were staying in the galley or the back of the plane, were not coming forward to defend Monique or to challenge Captain Bradley's behavior, and Monique understood they were probably afraid, probably knew that challenging a captain meant risking their own jobs, probably had learned through experience that crew members who spoke up against discrimination often faced retaliation while perpetrators faced nothing, and she didn't blame them for their silence even as she desperately wished someone with authority would intervene, would say this has gone too far, would stop Captain Bradley from continuing this humiliation. "Ma'am, this is your final warning," Captain Bradley said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who controlled whether this plane took off, who had power over every person on this aircraft including Monique, who could call security and have her dragged off and banned from future flights, who held all the cards while she held none. "You either move to economy voluntarily right now or I'm calling airport police and you'll be removed from this aircraft and banned from Delta. You'll miss your flight and possibly face charges for disrupting operations and refusing crew instructions. Is that what you want? Do you want to be arrested and humiliated even more than you already are? Because I'm done being patient, I've given you multiple chances to cooperate and you've refused, so make your choice, move now or be removed. Monique felt trapped in an impossible situation, felt the walls closing in as she calculated her options and found them all terrible, found that complying meant accepting humiliation and confirming Captain Bradley's racism was acceptable, meant teaching her unborn daughter that black women should submit when white authority told them they didn't belong, meant living with the memory of having been forced to the back without fighting, but that resisting meant potentially being dragged off by police, meant possibly being arrested, meant definitely missing her presentation in LA, meant trauma on top of trauma, meant her baby being subjected to even more stress, and neither option felt survivable, but one of them felt slightly less catastrophic, and she felt tears finally escaping despite her efforts to hold them back, felt hot tears sliding down her cheeks while Captain Bradley watched with satisfaction, while Marcus smirked, while passengers recorded her breakdown on their phones, capturing her most vulnerable moment for content they'd share without context, without explaining that her tears came from being told to move to the back while 7 months pregnant, from being called your kind by a pilot who should have been protecting her safety rather than threatening it. I need to use the restroom, Monique said quietly, her voice thick with tears. Before I move I need to use the restroom. I'm 7 months pregnant and I've been holding it. Please let me use the bathroom and then I'll do whatever you want. Just please let me have that dignity. And her request was so basic, so human, so reasonable that it should have prompted some softening in Captain Bradley's stance. Should have reminded him that regardless of whatever he thought about her ticket or her presence in first class, she was still a pregnant woman with biological needs that couldn't be ignored, but instead he said no, you'll use the restroom after you move to your proper seat. You'll follow my instructions in the order I give them. Now gather your belongings and stand up, and his refusal to grant even this small accommodation made Monique realize with devastating clarity that this wasn't about procedures or policies. This was about power. This was about a man who enjoyed having absolute authority over someone he'd decided was beneath him, who was willing to deny a pregnant woman access to a bathroom because controlling her mattered more than her comfort or her dignity. Monique placed both hands on her belly, feeling her daughter kicking frantically, feeling movement that suggested distress, that suggested her stress was affecting her baby in ways that terrified her, that made her think about all the warnings her doctor had given about avoiding trauma during pregnancy, about keeping stress levels low to protect fetal development, about the connection between maternal cortisol and infant outcomes, and she thought about how Captain Bradley's racism wasn't just hurting her, wasn't just violating her dignity, was potentially harming her unborn child, was creating medical risk on top of emotional trauma, and she felt rage mixing with her fear, felt fury that this man's prejudice could have consequences that extended beyond this flight, that could affect her daughter's health, that could cause complications she'd spend the rest of her life managing because a pilot decided to profile her. Please, Monique said, looking directly at Captain Bradley with tears streaming down her face, I'm begging you, I'm 7 months pregnant. My baby is kicking so hard it hurts. I'm scared this stress is hurting her. Please just let me sit in the seat I paid for. Please stop doing this to me. I haven't done anything wrong. I showed you my ticket. I showed you my doctor's letter. I've been polite and cooperative. Please just leave me alone. And her plea was so raw, so completely stripped of any pretense or pride, was pure desperation from someone who'd been pushed past her breaking point, and for a moment she thought maybe Bradley's face showed some flicker of recognition, some hint that he understood he'd gone too far, that targeting a pregnant woman crying and begging was beyond whatever racism had motivated his initial profiling, but the flicker, if it existed, disappeared quickly, replaced by hardened resolve. If you're concerned about your baby, you should have thought about that before refusing crew instructions, Captain Bradley said, his voice cold and unmoved by her tears. You created this situation by being difficult, by insisting you belong somewhere you clearly don't, by making this flight about you instead of cooperating like a reasonable passenger would. Now you're playing the victim, but you brought this on yourself. And his victim blaming was so cruel, so completely divorced from the reality of what had happened, was such thorough inversion of responsibility that Monique felt like she was in an alternate universe where discrimination was the victim's fault, where being targeted was something she'd chosen, where Captain Bradley's racism was somehow her responsibility to prevent rather than his responsibility to not inflict. Passengers who'd been watching in silence were starting to show signs of discomfort that went beyond awkwardness, were starting to look like they recognized this had crossed a line, that watching a pregnant woman cry and beg while a pilot remained unmoved was too much even for people who'd been willing to stay quiet through the earlier confrontation, and one woman toward the back of first class said quietly to her companion, "This isn't right. He should stop," and her companion shushed her and said, "Don't get involved, just let them handle it," and their whispered exchange captured perfectly the dynamic that allowed discrimination to flourish, the calculation that speaking up carried risk while staying quiet felt safe even when safety meant complicity, even when silence meant watching someone suffer and doing nothing to help. Marcus pulled out his phone and said to Captain Bradley, "Should I call ahead to LA and have security meet us? Should I report her as an uncooperative passenger so it's documented? We need to protect ourselves in case she tries to file a complaint. We need our version on record first." And his strategic thinking about documentation, about getting ahead of any complaint Monique might file, about protecting himself and Bradley rather than questioning whether their treatment of her was appropriate, revealed how systems of discrimination operated, how perpetrators thought about covering themselves, how racism persisted because people who engaged in it were smart about creating paper trails that justified their actions, about framing victims as problems, about ensuring that any investigation would hear crew's version first and give it more weight than passengers' claims. Monique stood up slowly, her movements hampered by her pregnant belly, by her exhaustion, by the tears that were still falling, by the emotional devastation of having been broken by racism that operated with such confidence and such support, and she gathered her bag from the overhead bin, and she took one last look at seat 2A that she'd paid for, that her doctor had recommended, that represented comfort and dignity that were being stolen from her, and she began walking toward the back of the plane while Captain Bradley and Marcus watched her with expressions of satisfaction, expressions that communicated they'd won, they'd asserted their authority, they'd put her in her place. But as Monique walked through first class past the passengers who'd watched her humiliation without intervening, past the phones that had recorded her tears without offering help, past the silent witnesses who'd chosen comfort over courage, she made a decision that would change everything, made a choice that Captain Bradley in his arrogance hadn't anticipated, made a move that would prove his confident assertion that complaints never mattered was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. Monique stopped walking halfway through the first-class cabin, stopped between rows 4 and 5 while Captain Bradley and Marcus watched, expecting her to continue to economy, to complete her displacement, to accept the verdict they delivered, and instead she pulled out her phone with hands that were still shaking, with tears still streaming down her face, with her baby still kicking frantically against her ribs, and she unlocked it and scrolled through her contacts and found the name she needed. The person who could help when no one else would, the man who'd promised her that if she ever needed him he'd be there no matter what, and she pressed call and lifted the phone to her ear while Captain Bradley said, "What are you doing? I told you to move to the back. Put that phone away and keep walking." But Monique ignored him, stood there in the aisle while the phone rang once, twice, and then connected. "David," Monique said, and her voice broke completely on his name, broke with relief at hearing him answer, broke with the weight of everything that had just happened, broke with accumulated trauma that she could finally release because she wasn't alone anymore, wasn't abandoned anymore, had someone who would believe her and protect her and use his power to ensure consequences. "David, I need you to hear what just happened. I need you to listen to everything. I'm on the plane," and the captain told me to move to the back. He said, "We don't need your kind in first class." He said, "I don't belong here." The flight attendant laughed at me, passengers recorded me crying, and no one helped, no one said anything, and I'm so tired and the baby is kicking so hard and I don't know what to do. And her words came out in a rush of pain and fear, came out as testimony delivered to the one person who had power to do something about this, who had authority that exceeded Captain Bradley's, who could transform her powerlessness into consequences. "Baby, slow down," David said, his voice shifting immediately from the casual warmth of answering his wife's call to steel-edged focus, his tone becoming the voice of the chief operating officer of Delta Airlines rather than the concerned husband, becoming the authority that oversaw every pilot and every flight and every crew member in the company. "Tell me exactly what happened. Tell me who did this. Tell me everything while it's fresh. I'm recording this call and I need details." And Monique took a shaking breath and recounted everything. Captain Bradley stopping at her row, demanding her boarding pass, examining it like it was fraudulent, declaring there was a seating error, telling her first class was for passengers who booked correctly, raising his voice about her making other passengers uncomfortable, threatening to have security remove her. Marcus, the flight attendant, making jokes about her thinking first class meant the first seat she saw. Passengers laughing at her humiliation. Bradley leaning close and saying, "We don't need your kind up here, back of the plane where you belong," denying her request to use the bathroom, refusing to accept her documentation, making her cry in front of everyone, forcing her to give up her seat and walk to economy while people recorded her tears. David listened in silence that felt like gathering storm, listened without interrupting while Monique delivered her testimony, while she documented every detail of discrimination that had targeted his wife, his pregnant wife, the woman he loved, and the daughter they were about to welcome. And when Monique finished, there was silence on the line for 3 seconds that felt like eternity, silence where Monique could almost hear David processing, could almost feel his rage building, could almost sense decisions being made about consequences that would be swift and severe and permanent. And then David said with voice that was calm but carried absolute authority, "Put him on the phone, put Captain Bradley on the phone right now, I need to speak with him directly." Monique lowered her phone and looked at Captain Bradley, who was watching her with irritation mixed with confusion, who clearly thought her phone call was some attempt to contact a lawyer or file a complaint or do something that would be meaningless because complaints never mattered, because crew always won these confrontations, because his 25 years of flying had taught him that passengers who threatened consequences rarely delivered them. And she said with voice that was steadier now, that was reinforced by knowing help was coming, that was supported by her husband's fury on her behalf, "It's for you, my husband wants to speak with you." And she held out her phone toward Captain Bradley with expression that was calm despite her tears, that showed she knew something he didn't, that communicated his confidence was about to be shattered. Captain Bradley scoffed and said, "I'm not taking a phone call from some angry husband. I don't have time for this. You need to move to economy now and stop disrupting my flight." But Monique said, "You'll want to take this call. I promise you'll want to take this call. Trust me." And something in her tone made Bradley hesitate, made him reach out and take her phone with expression that mixed annoyance with slight uncertainty, and he lifted it to his ear and said, "This is Captain Richard Bradley. Is this, and what do you want?" His voice carrying the authority of someone who expected deference, who expected an angry passenger's husband to back down when confronted with pilot credentials. "This is David Davis," the voice on the other end said, Chief Operating Officer of Delta Airlines, and Captain Bradley's face went pale, went from irritation to shock to dawning horror in the space of seconds, went through transformation that passengers nearby noticed, that made them lean forward trying to hear what was being said, that made Marcus step closer with concern replacing his earlier smirk, and David continued, "The woman you just humiliated is my wife, the pregnant woman you told to move to the back is carrying my daughter, the passenger you called your kind is the person I love more than anything, and you just made the worst mistake of your career. You're grounded effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation, and based on what I just heard you describe to my wife, you're going to be terminated. You will never fly for Delta again. You will never fly commercially again. Your career is over. Do you understand me? Your racism just cost you everything." Captain Bradley stammered, tried to form words, tried to say something that would walk back what had happened, that would explain or justify or minimize, but David cut him off saying, "I don't want to hear excuses. I don't want to hear explanations. I heard everything you did. My wife documented everything, and airline security is being dispatched to remove you from that aircraft right now. You have 30 minutes left in that uniform before you're stripped of your wings permanently," and David hung up, leaving Bradley standing there holding Monique's phone with color drained from his face, with his world collapsing around him, with passengers gasping as they realized what they'd just witnessed, what they'd participated in through their silence, what their recordings had captured, that the pregnant black woman they'd watched being humiliated was married to the man who controlled every pilot's career, that their complicity in her degradation had been observed by someone with power to ensure consequences they'd assumed would never come. Bradley handed Monique's phone back to her with hands that shook visibly, with expression that had transformed from confident authority to devastated recognition, with face that showed he understood exactly what he'd done, exactly who he'd targeted, exactly what he'd lost, and he tried to speak, tried to say, "Mrs. Davis, I didn't know. I didn't realize. If I'd known who you were, I never would have." But Monique cut him off with voice that was steady now, that was reinforced by her husband's. intervention, that carried dignity that Bradley had tried to strip but couldn't eliminate. And she said if you'd known who I was, if you'd known my husband's position, then you wouldn't have discriminated against me, but you had no problem discriminating when you thought I was powerless, when you thought I was just another black passenger you could humiliate without consequences. That's what you're sorry about? Not that you were racist, but that you targeted someone with connections, that you got caught, that your racism is going to cost you instead of being something you get away with like you've apparently gotten away with it for years. Marcus, who'd been watching this reversal with growing panic, stepped forward and said Captain Bradley didn't mean any harm. This was just a misunderstanding. Mrs. Davis, surely you can see this was just confusion about seating. We can resolve this. You can return to your first-class seat. We can forget this happened. Please don't let this affect Captain Bradley's career over what was essentially a miscommunication. And his attempt to reframe explicit racism as miscommunication, his effort to protect himself and Bradley by minimizing what had occurred, his assumption that Monique would accept apology now that power dynamics had shifted, showed he understood nothing, learned nothing, recognized only that consequences were coming but not that consequences were deserved, that his mockery and Bradley's discrimination warranted punishment rather than forgiveness. Monique looked at Marcus and said, "You made jokes about me, you laughed at me, you told passengers maybe I thought first class meant the first seat I saw. You participated in humiliating me, you encouraged other passengers to laugh at a pregnant woman being forced from her seat, and now you want me to forget this happened? You want me to protect your career? You want me to show you mercy you never considered showing me? But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ensure you face exactly the consequences you deserve. My husband is going to review your employment file, and I suspect he's going to find this wasn't your first incident, that you've done this before to other passengers who didn't have connections, who filed complaints that went nowhere, who suffered your racism without recourse. But your pattern ends today. Your career ends today." Passengers who'd been silent during Monique's humiliation were now finding their voices, were now saying things like, "I'm so sorry I didn't speak up. This was wrong. I should have defended you." And their belated apologies felt hollow, felt like attempts to distance themselves from what had happened now that consequences were visible, felt like moral cowardice disguised as delayed recognition. And Monique said to the cabin at large, "You all watched this happen. You all recorded it. You all stayed silent while a pilot told me to move to the back, while a flight attendant mocked me, while I cried and begged, and not one of you said anything until you realized I had power, until you understood there would be consequences, until speaking up became safe instead of risky. And I want you to think about that. I want you to remember that you chose silence, that you were complicit, that your comfort mattered more to you than my dignity. And I hope next time you'll be braver. I hope next time you'll speak up when it matters instead of apologizing after it's too late." The announcement came over the PA system, a voice that wasn't Captain Bradley's, a different pilot saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Chen. We're experiencing a crew change that will delay our departure. Please remain seated. We apologize for the inconvenience." And Bradley's face showed he understood what that meant, understood he was being removed, understood his flying days for Delta were over. And he stood there in the aisle looking lost, looking like someone whose identity had been built around being a pilot, and that identity was being stripped away in real time, whose authority that he'd wielded so confidently minutes ago had evaporated, whose racism that he'd expressed so openly had finally found consequences. Airline security appeared at the aircraft door, two uniformed officers who walked down the aisle directly to Captain Bradley, who identified themselves and said, "Captain Bradley, you need to come with us. You're being removed from duty effective immediately. Please surrender your credentials." And Bradley reached for the wings pin on his uniform, the symbol of his rank that he'd earned over 25 years, that represented his career and his status and his authority, and he unpinned them with hands that shook, with face that showed devastation, with recognition that this small piece of metal represented everything he was losing, and he handed the wings to the security officer who placed them in an evidence bag. And the symbolic weight of that moment, of a pilot being stripped of his wings in front of passengers, made several people gasp, made the reality of consequences visible in ways that felt almost uncomfortable even for people who'd wanted Bradley punished. Marcus was also asked to step aside, was told he was suspended pending investigation, was informed he should gather his belongings and exit the aircraft with security, and his face showed shock mixed with anger, showed he'd thought maybe he'd escape consequences, that maybe targeting Monique had been Bradley's sin alone, But David's investigation was apparently thorough, was apparently holding everyone accountable, was apparently ensuring that participating in discrimination carried costs. Whether you'd initiated it or just encouraged it, whether you'd been the primary aggressor or just the supportive colleague who'd made jokes, and passengers watched in silence as both Bradley and Marcus were escorted off the aircraft, watched the walk of shame up the aisle toward the exit, watched careers ending in real time because racism had finally found someone with power to ensure consequences. And the cabin felt heavy with recognition that what they'd witnessed and recorded and stayed silent about had resulted in terminations that wouldn't have happened if Monique hadn't had connections, wouldn't have occurred if her husband hadn't been chief operating officer, wouldn't have materialized if she'd been just another black passenger without access to authority. The flight was delayed for 90 minutes while a replacement crew was brought in, while new captain and new flight attendants took over operations, while paperwork was completed and security protocols were followed, and Monique returned to seat 2A that was finally uncontested, that was acknowledged as legitimately hers, that no one questioned or challenged now that everyone knew who she was, knew who her husband was, knew that targeting her had been a catastrophic mistake, and she sat in her first-class window seat feeling exhausted and traumatized and vindicated all at once, feeling relief that consequences had come but also carrying the weight of wondering how many other passengers had experienced similar discrimination without recourse, how many people had been told to move to the back without having husbands who were chief operating officers, how many victims of Bradley's racism over 25 years had filed complaints that went nowhere, had suffered humiliation that never resulted in justice, had carried trauma that no one validated or addressed or punished. But David didn't stop with Bradley and Marcus, didn't consider 2 terminations sufficient response to what had happened to his wife, didn't believe that removing the most visible perpetrators would fix a culture that had enabled them, and within hours of Monique's call he'd initiated a company-wide investigation into discrimination complaints, had ordered HR to pull every allegation of racial profiling from the past 5 years, had demanded to know why complaints had been filed and investigated but never resulted in terminations, why patterns of discriminatory behavior had been documented but not punished, why employees like Bradley could operate for decades while accumulating complaints without facing career-ending consequences, and what he discovered made him furious, made him recognize that his airline had systems in place that protected perpetrators rather than victims, that treated discrimination as training issue rather than termination offense, that allowed racism to flourish because the costs of complaining were higher than the costs of discriminating. The investigation revealed that Bradley had 2 prior complaints from black passengers who'd alleged he'd questioned their tickets without cause, who'd reported feeling profiled and dismissed, who'd filed formal grievances that had resulted in additional bias training for Bradley but no suspension or demotion or notation in his permanent file that would affect his career progression. And those complaints had been buried in HR records where they'd sat as warnings that went unheeded, as red flags. That no one elevated, as patterns that no one recognized as dangerous until Bradley's racism had escalated to telling a pregnant woman to move to the back while her husband listened on the phone. Marcus had 3 prior complaints, all from passengers of color, all describing mockery or dismissive treatment or microaggressions that had made their flights uncomfortable, and like Bradley he'd received training but no meaningful discipline, had been told to be more sensitive but faced no consequences that would have deterred future discrimination, had learned that racism was tolerable as long as you weren't caught by someone with power. David's investigation expanded to identify every Delta employee with documented patterns of racial discrimination complaints, every crew member whose file showed multiple allegations that had been addressed through training rather than termination, every staff member whose behavior suggested they posed ongoing risk to passengers who looked like Monique, and he found 14 employees total, pilots and flight attendants and gate agents, people spread across different cities and different departments, people who'd collectively accumulated dozens of complaints from black and brown passengers, people who'd made Delta flights uncomfortable or hostile or traumatic for travelers who'd done nothing except book tickets while having skin color that triggered suspicion, and David made the decision that all 14 would be terminated, that patterns of discrimination would no longer be tolerated, that his airline would have zero tolerance policy that meant zero tolerance, not training, and warnings and second chances but immediate career-ending consequences. The 14 terminations happened within 2 weeks of Monique's incident, happened quickly enough that employees understood this wasn't performative response to public pressure but genuine commitment to cultural change, happened with enough documentation and legal review that wrongful termination claims would be difficult to sustain, happened with press releases that explained Delta was implementing new standards, was refusing to employ people who made passengers feel unwelcome based on race, was choosing passenger dignity over employee retention, and the terminations sent shockwaves through the airline industry, sent message to other carriers that maybe discrimination complaints needed to be taken more seriously, sent warning to crew members everywhere that racism could cost careers even if it had been tolerated for years. David implemented what he called the MD standard, named after Monique's initials, a new zero-tolerance policy that made explicit what should have been obvious, that racial profiling of passengers would result in immediate termination, that discrimination complaints would be investigated by independent reviewers rather than internal HR, that patterns of bias would be tracked and addressed before they escalated, that crew members who witnessed discrimination by colleagues would be protected and rewarded for reporting rather than being pressured into silence, that passengers who filed complaints would receive direct communication about outcomes rather than form letter acknowledgments that revealed nothing, and the MD standard became model that other airlines studied, became reference point for what zero tolerance actually meant when implemented seriously rather than as slogan. But the consequences weren't limited to employment, weren't contained within Delta's organizational boundaries, because Bradley's termination made news, became story that media covered because pregnant woman told to move to the back by pilot whose career ended when her husband turned out to be chief operating officer was narrative too compelling to ignore, was contemporary echo of civil rights history that resonated with audiences who wanted to believe discrimination met consequences, and Bradley's name became permanently associated with racism, became searchable on internet, became first result when anyone Googled him, became definition of his legacy rather than his 25 years of flying, and he discovered that being terminated from Delta meant being unemployable in commercial aviation, that other airlines wouldn't hire pilots fired for discrimination, that his career was over at 55 not because he'd lost skills but because he'd revealed character, and he spent his remaining working years flying cargo for small regional carriers, jobs that paid fraction of what he'd earned at Delta, that offered none of the prestige or status he'd enjoyed, that represented spectacular fall from authority he'd wielded so confidently when he'd told Monique to move to the back. 3 months after the incident, Monique gave birth to a healthy baby girl they named Maya, delivered at 39 weeks after pregnancy that had been complicated by stress and anxiety that doctors attributed at least partially to the trauma she'd experienced on Flight 2156, to the racism that had targeted her when she was most vulnerable, to the humiliation that had required therapy to process, to the nightmares where she relived being told she didn't belong, being called your kind, being forced to walk through a cabin of silent witnesses while pregnant and crying, and holding Maya for the first time. Monique felt joy mixed with grief, felt love mixed with fury that her daughter was entering a world where pilots still told black women to move to the back, where racism operated so confidently that it took chief operating officer intervention to generate consequences, where her daughter would face discrimination that Monique couldn't always prevent no matter how many policies changed or how many employees got fired. David framed the termination letter he'd signed for Captain Richard Bradley, had it professionally mounted and hung it in his home office where he could see it daily, where it served as reminder of why his position mattered, why having black executives in authority was essential, why representation at highest levels of corporations translated to protection for vulnerable people who would otherwise have no recourse. And beneath the framed letter, he placed a small plaque that read "Nobody disrespects my family, nobody," words that captured both his love for Monique and Maya and his commitment to using power to ensure accountability, to making sure that discrimination faced costs, to transforming his rage at what had happened to his wife into systemic change that would protect other passengers. But the resolution wasn't clean, wasn't Hollywood ending where justice erased trauma, because Monique developed PTSD from the incident that persisted long after Maya's birth, developed anxiety about flying that made her career as architect more difficult because site visits and client meetings often required air travel, would have panic attacks in airports that left her shaking and crying. would relive Bradley's voice saying move to the back every time she saw a pilot in uniform, would feel her hands trembling and her baby kicking, phantom sensations that her therapist said were trauma responses, were her body remembering threat even when threat wasn't present, and she required ongoing therapy to manage symptoms that medication helped but didn't eliminate, that time softened but didn't erase, that became part of who she was rather than something she could fully overcome. She struggled with guilt about the 14 employees who'd been terminated in the aftermath, struggled with feeling responsible for people losing their jobs even though rationally she knew they'd lost their jobs because of their own discrimination, because of patterns of behavior they'd chosen, because of racism they'd inflicted on passengers who deserved dignity. But emotionally, she carried weight of knowing her complaint had catalyzed investigation that ended careers, that her connection to David had given her access to justice that other victims hadn't had, that she'd been protected by privilege of marriage while countless others had suffered without recourse, and her therapist kept telling her that guilt was misplaced, that she wasn't responsible for consequences that perpetrators had earned, that her protection didn't diminish others' suffering but illuminated systems that needed changing. If this story broke your heart, if it made you realize that staying silent when pregnant women are being discriminated against makes you complicit in their trauma, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the person who speaks up next time, who challenges pilots and crew when they profile passengers, who refuses to let racism operate unchallenged even when intervention feels uncomfortable. Because Monique needed that cabin full of passengers to defend her and got cameras and silence instead, and your voice next time could prevent someone from developing PTSD, could stop discrimination before it escalates, could be difference between trauma and safety. So hit that subscribe button if you believe pregnant Black women deserve dignity regardless of who their husbands are. Delta faced backlash from some employees and some customers who claimed David had overreacted, who said 14 terminations was excessive, who argued that discrimination complaints were often exaggerated or misunderstood, who framed the MD standard as political correctness destroying careers over minor incidents, and conservative media ran segments about chief operating officer whose wife got special treatment, whose personal vendetta resulted in mass firings, whose implementation of zero tolerance policy was really reverse discrimination against white employees, and David received death threats, received emails calling him racial slurs, received messages saying he was destroying Delta from the inside, received hatred that confirmed he was doing exactly what needed doing because racists were afraid of consequences they'd avoided for decades. But he also received messages of gratitude from Black passengers who'd filed complaints years ago and never heard outcomes, who said thank you for believing victims, thank you for taking discrimination seriously, thank you for showing that complaints matter when they're heard by people with power and commitment to justice, received letters from employees of color who said we finally feel safe reporting discrimination. We finally believe management will protect us rather than perpetrators. We finally think Delta might become workplace where everyone is treated with dignity, and those messages sustained him through backlash, reminded him why transformation was worth the cost, why using his position to ensure accountability mattered more than protecting his comfort or avoiding controversy. Passenger discrimination complaints dropped 68% in the first year under the MD standard, dropped because crew members understood that profiling passengers could end careers, dropped because independent investigation meant complaints couldn't be buried, dropped because zero tolerance actually meant zero tolerance rather than being slogan without enforcement, and David counted that statistic as vindication, as proof that consequences changed behavior, as evidence that his response to what happened to Monique had protected countless future passengers from experiencing similar trauma. Bradley never apologized sincerely, never took full responsibility, died bitter at 72 blaming Monique for ruining his career rather than accepting that his racism had ruined it, died having learned nothing except that targeting connected people was dangerous while targeting vulnerable people was safe as long as you didn't get caught, died defined by worst thing he'd done rather than by decades of service, and his obituary mentioned his termination from Delta more prominently than his years of flying, reduced him to cautionary tale about how hatred destroys everyone it touches but destroys perpetrators differently than victims, leaves different kinds of scars. Monique and David raised Maya with stories about the day she was born, about the fight that preceded her arrival, about the racism that targeted her mother and the consequences that followed, about the importance of using power to protect vulnerable people, about the responsibility that came with privilege. And Maya grew up understanding that her father's position had saved her mother, that connections had provided justice that others didn't receive, that systemic change required people in authority who cared about equity, and she carried that understanding into her own life, into her own choices about how to use whatever advantages she inherited. And sometimes late at night when Maya was sleeping and the house was quiet, Monique would stand in David's office looking at Bradley's framed termination letter, looking at the plaque that said "Nobody disrespects my family," and she'd feel complicated emotions, feel satisfaction that consequences had come but grief that they'd been necessary, feel pride that systemic change had resulted but sorrow that it had required her trauma to catalyze it, feel gratitude for David's intervention but anger that intervention had been needed, feel all the contradictions of justice that arrived too late to prevent harm but early enough to prevent future harm, a victory that felt incomplete because wounds remained even after battles were won, of transformation that carried cost that would never fully heal but that meant something, meant her suffering hadn't been meaningless, meant Maya would inherit worlds slightly better than the one Monique had endured, and sometimes that had to be enough.